In the warm Mediterranean summer of 1936, Spain, a land of ancient beauty and deep divisions, stood on the precipice of catastrophe. What began as a military uprising would explode into a savage civil war, becoming the first bloody battlefield where the forces of fascism, communism, and democracy clashed openly, a deadly dress rehearsal for the Second World War. This is episode 6 of our long-form journey through the origins of the Second World War. In our last episode, we journeyed across East Asia, tracing the tensions and conflicts that were drawing China and Japan toward war. Now, as you settle in and let the day fall away, we turn westward to the hills and cities of Spain. Tonight's story explores the forces that split the nation in two, the desperate defense of Madrid, the tragedy of Guernica, the idealism of the international brigades, and how foreign powers transformed this internal struggle into a prelude to global conflict. I've spent many hours researching and shaping this narrative so it can guide you gently towards sleep, while still giving you a clear, steady understanding of how the Spanish Civil War accelerated the world toward catastrophe. If this calm style of storytelling helps you rest, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe, and if you'd like, share where you're listening from and what time of night you've joined us. It's always meaningful to see this quiet community gathering from around the world. Take a slow breath and let's begin. A small plane sat waiting on the sunlit field. Having rested in the Canary Islands across several peaceful days while appearing simply as a hired craft for British holiday visitors, savouring their time away, it carried an everyday calmness that veiled the extraordinary events soon to unfold beneath clear skies. 2 o'clock arrived on the 18th of July in 1936. 3 Spanish gentlemen stepped forward at that precise hour and boarded the waiting aircraft, telling its pilot Cecil Bebb to begin the takeoff sequence as they settled into their places with quiet determination. Bebb had prepared himself for these passengers and understood the course would lead toward Tetuan in Spanish Morocco. Yet the full nature of their undertaking remained hidden from his understanding, leaving him with only a vague sense of importance surrounding the journey across the waters. The engines came alive with a steady vibration. As the Dragon Rapid rose into the open air and turned toward its distant point, the rhythmic sound filled the interior space, while the landscape fell away into a tapestry of blue sea stretching endlessly below, creating a meditative flow that seemed to suspend time itself. One traveller made a remarkable adjustment midway through the crossing. Quietly shedding his formal dark clothing for the distinctive khaki uniform, accented by a tasseled sash denoting high military rank, the man revealed himself as a Spanish general in a transformation that filled the pilot with genuine surprise amid the confined cabin. This shift in appearance brought a new gravity to the atmosphere inside the aircraft. The fabric of the uniform caught faint glimmers from the windows as the plane continued its path, marking a silent turning point where ordinary travel gave way to something profoundly consequential. Instructions came as the destination drew near. The general directed Bebb to guide the craft at a lower altitude so he could examine a small gathering of individuals positioned close to the landing area with careful attention. His eyes moved across the scene with focused intent. Upon identifying a particular figure among those on the ground, he gave the order for an immediate landing, his voice carrying the weight of long-awaited coordination. The plane descended smoothly toward the Moroccan soil, touching down with a gentle bump that stirred light dust into the warm air. it rolled to a stop where the general could exit into the prepared reception. Salutes greeted him in a formal display. He stepped out to receive these honors, along with warm confirmations that he had arrived safely among trusted companions, ready to support the developing effort. In that moment, General Francisco Franco entered the unfolding drama. He was a central figure in the coordinated military action against the left-leaning administration that had governed Spain for 5 years. He took command of 24,000 soldiers who supported the movement for change. The arrival carried an understated power. Franco stood prepared to take charge of those forces sympathetic to the cause, his presence on the field signaling the activation of plans that had simmered beneath the surface for some time. Warm breezes moved across the airfield as the scene settled. The general's uniform stood out against the surroundings, while assurances continued to flow from those gathered, reinforcing the bonds of loyalty in this pivotal location. Such a flight from island isolation to mainland readiness held deep resonance. It represented the conveyance of leadership across geographical divides into the heart of tensions building within the nation, all beginning in the unassuming form of a light passenger plane. The pilot observed the proceedings with lingering astonishment. What had begun as a routine charter revealed its true dimensions through the general's emergence and the respectful welcome that followed his descent from the aircraft. History often turns on such modest thresholds. This particular landing at Tetuan marked the point where one man's command over sympathetic troops would begin to shape larger conflicts, emerging from the quiet preparations of the preceding days. The sun continued its path overhead during these exchanges. Its light highlighted the details of the uniform and the expressions of those assembled, casting a calm yet significant glow over the initial moments of Franco's involvement in the events. With command assumed amid the salutes and friendly words, the stage was quietly set. 24,000 men awaited the guidance of this general who had crossed the distance to join them in their shared endeavor against the established Republican order. The journey had concluded in this revealing way. From the initial boarding under the guise of everyday travel to the striking change during flight and the deliberate low approach, every element converged toward this arrival filled with purpose and potential. Even as the plane's engines cooled after their long effort, the implications rippled outward. Franco now stood ready among allies, his role as leader of the sympathetic forces becoming the focal point from which broader developments would spring in the days ahead. This opening sequence unfolded with deliberate calm. It wove together the elements of anticipation, surprise, and formal recognition into a tapestry that hinted at the profound shifts awaiting the country, all initiated through that single flight on a summer afternoon. What started as a calculated military challenge against the established order would gradually expand across 33 months of bitter struggle, growing far beyond the immediate Spanish countryside into something that carried lasting weight for the wider world. The war took on dimensions no one could have fully anticipated at first. It unfolded as a haunting foreshadowing of the immense global conflict soon to come, functioning like an elaborate dress rehearsal where fresh weapons received their trial by fire, where emerging tactical approaches were refined in real conditions, and where several of the principal players who would later determine the course of the worldwide catastrophe gained vital early experience in the harsh realities of modern warfare. Powerful nations began to reveal their allegiances through concrete actions, Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy extended their reach by sending both fighting men and substantial supplies directly to support Franco's side, bolstering the nationalist effort with resources that would prove decisive in many key engagements. The response from the East arrived with equal determination. The Soviet Union provided comparable aid to the Republican government, dispatching personnel alongside essential military equipment to help sustain the defense of the elected republic against its challengers. The major Western powers, however, held back from any such commitment. Both the United States and the nations of France and Britain deliberately maintained their distance, choosing not to become directly involved in the fighting, despite the intensifying pressures from other quarters. Yet the Spanish conflict awakened more than just strategic calculations. It also sparked a remarkable surge of personal idealism and profound willingness to sacrifice among people living within the democratic societies of the West. Thousands upon thousands of young men undertook difficult journeys. They made their way across the steep passes of the Pyrenees Mountains, entering Spain not under any official directive from their homelands, but purely because their own deeply held convictions urged them forward. These individuals steeled themselves for the possibility of death in a distant land. Many ultimately did surrender their lives there, drawn in part by the chance to take a stand against spreading dictatorship, yet moved even more powerfully by the sense that they were witnessing an essential confrontation between those who possessed wealth and those who lived without it, between oppressors and the oppressed. There existed another current flowing among these foreign participants. Hardened communist activists and street fighters also joined the cause, regarding the Spanish War as a practical academy where they could sharpen their skills in the demanding arts of revolutionary struggle and organized resistance. The atmosphere of those years carried an undercurrent of uneasy anticipation. As events in Spain unfolded beneath Mediterranean skies, distant observers felt the subtle shift of history gathering momentum, even as the conflict revealed both the noblest aspirations and the most calculated ambitions of a troubled era. Spain became a canvas upon which larger ideologies painted their visions. The land itself seemed to absorb the hopes and fears of outsiders who traveled there seeking meaning through action, their footsteps tracing patterns that would echo through the coming decade of global upheaval. Foreign involvement added layers of complexity to the fighting. While some powers committed material and human resources to one side or the other, the Western democracies watched from the sidelines with a caution born of their desire to avoid being drawn into another catastrophic entanglement so soon after the previous Great War. This choice of non-intervention carried its own quiet consequences. It left the Spanish people largely to face their internal divisions with whatever external help they could secure from those willing to engage directly in the fray. The idealists who crossed the borders brought with them a special kind of light. Their readiness to risk everything for a cause not their own spoke to something timeless in the human spirit, a willingness to defend perceived justice even when it meant leaving behind familiar comforts and safety. Among them moved men of more pragmatic revolutionary intent. These seasoned fighters saw the Spanish battlefields as an opportunity to test theories in practice, honing methods that they believed would serve larger movements in the years ahead. The war thus served multiple purposes simultaneously. It tested new instruments of destruction, allowed major actors to gain experience, and inspired both genuine humanitarian commitment and calculated ideological preparation. In the end, the Spanish Civil War stood as more than a local tragedy. It functioned as a mirror reflecting the tensions that would soon fracture the peace of the entire world. drawing in forces and individuals whose actions would resonate long after the final shots echoed across the Iberian Peninsula. The Mediterranean winds seemed to carry whispers of these greater stakes. They moved across the contested landscapes where young volunteers and seasoned operatives alike found themselves caught in a conflict whose true scale only time would fully reveal. Such was the broader canvas upon which the Spanish drama played out. A conflict born from deep national divisions had transformed into an international stage where the future of Europe and beyond began to take its preliminary shape in fire and conviction. The view from inside the country remained clouded with nuance. For those who walked the streets and worked the fields of Spain, the gathering tensions did not present themselves in simple terms, but rather as a dense mixture of old resentments, economic hardship, and competing loyalties that had accumulated across many troubled generations. Spain had long functioned as a deeply fractured society. Regional differences, class distinctions, and ideological disagreements had created lasting rifts that made collective progress feel like an elusive dream, where every attempt at unity seemed to encounter resistance from entrenched positions. Violence had taken root as an almost familiar presence in daily affairs. It appeared alongside a stubborn undercurrent of injustice that affected people from all walks of life, turning what might have been ordinary disagreements into moments of dangerous confrontation. A grim record marked the political history of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In the years stretching from 1870 to 1921, 4 prime ministers lost their lives to assassination, each incident revealing the intense passions and instability that simmered at the center of national power. Toward the end of the 1920s, the cities became centers of growing agitation. Workers began to push back more determinedly against the suppression of their unions and the difficult reality of sweatshop conditions in the factories, where exploitation and harsh discipline defined the experience of labor for countless men and women. The countryside offered an even more striking illustration of imbalance as the 1930s began. 7,000 absentee landlords in one major rural region controlled 60% of the entire arable land, maintaining their hold on vast properties from afar, while the actual tillers of the soil lived in conditions of extreme deprivation. Millions of landless peasants continued to struggle under this arrangement. They labored on estates they did not own, barely able to provide for their families through endless days of work that yielded only the most minimal means of survival. All of these strains developed under the framework of a traditional monarchy, the ancient Bourbon line, supported by a series of dictatorial prime ministers, upheld a system of rule that had become exceptionally rigid and difficult to reform. The governing structures had grown so cumbersome and unresponsive that dissatisfaction spread even to the middle class. Families who enjoyed a measure of comfort and education started to voice their desire for greater participation in political life, believing that the existing order no longer served the needs of a changing nation. These underlying conditions created a fertile soil for unrest. Social divisions and economic inequalities had built up slowly but steadily, like underground rivers carving channels through stone, preparing the ground for larger upheavals. The Spanish sun would rise each morning over landscapes marked by these contradictions. Its light revealed both the beauty of the land and the human cost of systems that had endured beyond their time, casting long shadows across villages and city neighborhoods alike. Such were the social and economic roots that nourished the conflicts to come. They ran deep into the heart of Spanish life, helping to explain the intensity and complexity of the struggle that would soon engulf the entire country. Warm evening breezes drifted across the parched fields where so many toiled without claim. They stirred the dust of another long day and carried faint echoes of conversations among those who wondered how much longer the old patterns could hold, blending the scent of olive groves with the quiet ache of lives lived in perpetual want. In the shadowed alleys of factory towns, the sounds of closing shifts lingered. Men and women walked homeward with the weight of suppressed unions and relentless labor still upon them, their steps measured and thoughtful as the first stars appeared overhead. The monarchy and its ministers had presided for centuries. Their rule, once a symbol of continuity, had hardened into something distant and unyielding, prompting even comfortable households to question whether the nation's future required voices from beyond the traditional circles of power. These tensions flowed together beneath the surface, the extreme concentration of land, the battles of city workers, and the rigid traditions of governance formed a quiet current that moved steadily toward the horizon of greater change. The weight of accumulated troubles finally compelled a decision. Confronted by rising public dissatisfaction, the grip of a severe economic downturn, and the threat of possible armed insurrection, the regime of King Alfonso XIII agreed to hold general elections in the spring of 1931, with the stated intention of forming a government that would more faithfully represent the diverse voices of the Spanish people. The outcome of those elections carried transformative power. A Republican coalition secured a decisive victory at the polls, arriving in power with a strong popular mandate to dismantle the centuries-old monarchical system and chart a new course for the nation. King Alfonso responded to the results with measured words. He announced his abdication by noting that the Sunday bulletin had made it clear he no longer possessed the affection of his subjects, choosing to step aside rather than resist the clear will of the nation. His unpopularity had deep and personal roots. The king had long shown contempt for ordinary citizens, often describing them dismissively as rabble, and he had demonstrated this attitude through gestures such as shutting down the primary national highway so he could freely race his collection of expensive sports cars. The proclamation of the Republic did not magically dissolve old conflicts. Patterns of factional division and violent impulse continued to flow through Spanish society, refusing to vanish simply because a new form of government had been declared. In the countryside, the change in power released long-suppressed energies. During the initial months following the Republic's establishment in 1931, peasant groups set fire to large estates and religious buildings while carrying out acts of violence against some landlords in response to generations of inequality and hardship. Those property owners who escaped the immediate upheaval did not let their anger fade. Surviving landlords began keeping careful mental records of offenses, patiently awaiting an opportunity to balance the scales in the future. The Catholic Church found itself in a difficult position during this transition, having maintained close historical connections to the monarchy. Many devout Catholics resisted the Republic's efforts to create a clear separation between religious institutions and state affairs, gradually becoming firm supporters of right-wing causes. Urban areas experienced repeated cycles of disturbance. Factory districts witnessed periodic outbreaks of intense rioting as workers expressed their frustrations through direct and sometimes destructive action. The Republican authorities often responded with considerable force. The new army units frequently employed what many viewed as excessive harshness when suppressing these labor demonstrations, adding to the atmosphere of mutual suspicion. Senior military figures who had retained their commands harbored particular resentment. Many of these officers directed stronger opposition toward the Republic's reforming policies than they had ever shown toward the protesting workers themselves. Developments in the regions intensified their unease. When the government granted a measure of self-governance to Catalonia in 1932, army leaders began to fear that the fundamental integrity of Spain was being deliberately weakened. Talk of extending similar rights to the Basque provinces only confirmed their suspicions. Such considerations led many within the armed forces to conclude that the Republic was actively betraying the unity of the Spanish nation. The early life of the Republic thus unfolded against a backdrop of persistent tension. What had been welcomed as a fresh beginning quickly revealed itself as a time of continued upheaval, where the promise of reform collided with the realities of deep-seated divisions. Gentle winds moved through the olive groves and city squares in those hopeful yet uncertain months. They carried both the scent of new possibilities and the lingering smoke from fires lit by those seeking justice or revenge, blending the two in a complex atmosphere that touched every corner of the land. Church spires that had stood for centuries now cast different shadows. The push for secular governance created wounds in the faithful that would prove slow to heal, pushing many toward political alignments they might once have avoided. In the narrow streets near factories, the echoes of shouts and marching boots lingered. The heavy-handed responses to worker unrest planted seeds of distrust that would grow stronger as the years progressed. This period represented both birth and struggle. The Republic emerged into a world still shaped by the very forces it hoped to overcome, setting in motion a chain of events that would test the resilience of the Spanish people in profound ways. Divisions had carved themselves ever deeper into the Spanish soul. By the arrival of 1936, among the nearly 200 generals commanding the army, only a handful remained beyond doubt in their loyalty to the Republic, while a great many others had turned their thoughts and energies toward organized plots intended to topple the existing government. These stirrings within the military ranks met with sympathetic understanding in certain quarters. Conservative voices across the country offered quiet encouragement to such ambitions, none more so than the members of a rising right-wing movement that was beginning to assert itself with growing confidence. The Phalangists brought a new intensity to the political arena. Their beliefs mirrored the fascist approach that had taken hold in Italy, and they proudly bore a name drawn from the phalanx, that legendary close-ranked fighting unit of the ancient Greeks, symbolizing their commitment to strength, discipline, and unwavering national purpose. The nation had fractured with remarkable swiftness. In the course of only 4 brief years, Spain found itself split completely between left and right, with the two sides regarding one another across a gulf of suspicion that widened with every new confrontation. On the Republican side gathered a colorful assembly of supporters, socialists who dreamed of greater equality, communists pushing for fundamental change, determined trade unionists, and scattered liberal groups all lent their voices and efforts to the left, creating a broad coalition bound by shared aspirations for a more just society. Arrayed against them stood an equally resolute gathering of interests. Military commanders, fervent monarchists, nostalgic for the old regime, active phalangists, wealthy landowners guarding their estates, and the parties closely connected to the Roman Catholic Church all stood together in a solid right-wing front, dedicated to preserving tradition and order. The halls of Parliament echoed with this fundamental opposition. Although the left still held the balance of power in the Legislative Assembly, they faced increasingly forceful challenges from the right, whose members worked tirelessly to obstruct policies and build momentum for a different direction. Mounting demands from conservative factions could not be ignored indefinitely. Under this sustained pressure, the government consented to new general elections in February of 1936. in the hope that the people's voice might bring some measure of resolution to the escalating crisis. The balloting delivered another success for the left. When all the votes had been tallied, the Republican parties found themselves returned to power. Yet the triumph felt fragile, overshadowed by the bitter divisions that refused to subside. Rather than bringing calm, the election ushered in a darker chapter. A series of political murders began to claim lives on both sides of the divide, each killing deepening the atmosphere of fear and vengeance that hung over the country. A particularly significant loss occurred in mid-July. On the 13th of that month, José Calvo Sotelo, the prominent parliamentary spokesman for the right, fell victim to assassination, an event that sent waves of anger and alarm through conservative circles. His followers saw the killing as a point of final rupture. They declared it the last unacceptable outrage, the moment that could no longer be tolerated, and they pressed the military leadership to step forward and overthrow the republic without delay. The Spanish summer carried a particular stillness in those days. It seemed as though the very air held its breath, heavy with the knowledge that long-simmering conflicts were approaching their breaking point. This period of intense polarization marked a fateful turning. The February elections and the violence that followed revealed how completely Spain had divided into two hostile camps, each convinced that the future of the nation depended on its own victory. Beneath the surface of daily life, old wounds and fresh grievances continued to fester. People moved through their routines with a growing sense of unease, aware that the political storm clouds had gathered too thickly to be dispersed by words alone. In the end, the year 1936 brought the country to a precipice. What had begun as ideological disagreement had hardened into something far more dangerous, setting the stage for the conflict that would soon engulf the entire nation. The armed forces had grown restless with purpose. A tightly woven conspiracy now moved beneath the surface of Spanish life, guided by three generals whose contrasting natures would define the shape and spirit of the challenge that was about to break into the open during the warm days of July 1936. One figure carried the echo of an earlier disappointment. José Sanjurjo had already led a direct attempt to unseat the Republic in 1932, yet the effort collapsed almost at once, according to later accounts, because he had spoken too openly of his intentions during a personal encounter with a woman who then relayed the details to the authorities. Sent into exile after that failure, he refused to abandon the larger vision. From his base in Portugal, he worked steadily to secure firm promises of assistance from Germany, quietly strengthening the external support that might give the next effort a greater chance of success. His personal flaw would cut his journey short in a sudden and telling way. A man deeply attached to appearances, Sanjurjo filled the small plane intended for his return with far more elegant uniforms than the aircraft could safely carry, so that when the moment came, the overloaded machine could not rise properly from the short, tree-lined runway and crashed, claiming his life on the very threshold of the uprising. A second general brought cooler calculation and sharper resolve. Emilio Mola stood out as a more formidable architect of the plot, blending intricate strategy with an unrelenting will that few dared to oppose. He carried a history that had earned him lasting distrust among many Spaniards. As the widely hated Director of State Security during the years of King Alfonso, Mola had mastered the arts of surveillance and control, skills he now turned toward the careful orchestration of the anti-republican movement. His current command placed him in a position of strategic advantage. Mola directed troops across the northern provinces, where he prepared forces for the coming action, while also revealing an unusual preoccupation with the idea that Spain had grown too heavily industrialized. He would later express this belief in striking terms. During the fighting that followed, Mola urged German airmen to destroy at least half the factories in Bilbao, believing such destruction would restore a healthier balance to the Spanish nation in the long run. The third general moved with the greatest weight of authority. Francisco Franco emerged as the central and most powerful presence among the plotters, a man whose reputation for decisive and sometimes merciless action had already spread far beyond the barracks. His leadership of the Spanish Foreign Legion during the 1920s had forged a fearsome image in the minds of his opponents. To those who stood against him, Franco seemed the living embodiment of the Legion's harsh and uncompromising motto that proclaimed "Down with intelligence, long live death." One incident from those years lingered in the memory of those who served under him. When a furious legionnaire hurled his food at Franco and loudly protested that the meal was unfit for human consumption, the general calmly ordered the dish improved and then arranged for the man to be shot. Franco approached the conspiracy with patient deliberation. He advanced his involvement only after weighing every detail with meticulous care, refusing to commit until he felt certain the moment was truly ripe, so much so that the impatient Sanjurjo once burst out that the effort to save Spain would go forward with or without what he dismissively called "little Frankie boy." Yet Franco held a deeper awareness of what lay ahead. He cautioned those around him that anyone imagining a brief affair was mistaken, for the struggle would prove difficult, bloody, and far more extended than most expected. By the middle of July 1936, events had aligned in a way that satisfied his careful judgment. In the charged atmosphere that followed the assassination of the right-wing parliamentary leader, José Calvo Sotelo, Franco declared the time had come and gave his full support to the military appeal, framed as a sacred defense of the unity of the motherland. From his posting in the Canary Islands, he made final preparations for his own journey. He readied himself for the flight that would carry him across the sea and into the heart of the unfolding drama, ready to assume command at the appointed hour. Together, these three men had drawn the strands of discontent into a single cord through months of hidden messages, discreet meetings, and shared determination. Their plotting had transformed scattered grievances into a coordinated challenge poised to ignite across the country. The July air hung warm and still in those final days. In shadowed rooms where maps lay spread beneath low lamps, and in the quiet exchanges between trusted officers, the last decisions took shape beneath the surface of ordinary life. Such was the careful weaving of ambition and grievance that brought Spain to the edge of open rebellion. Three generals, each marked by his own strengths and shadows, had guided the nation toward a moment that would soon burst into the light of history, with consequences no one could yet fully measure. The formalities had drawn to a quiet close as the last words of welcome faded at the Tétouan airfield in Morocco on the 18th of July in 1936. General Francisco Franco formally took command of the Army of Africa, assuming leadership over a force whose unique composition would soon influence the opening movements of the rebellion with considerable force. This army was a complex and formidable gathering of men from different worlds. It consisted of the highly professional soldiers of the Spanish Foreign Legion, whose training had instilled a strong sense of discipline and reliability, alongside officers with sharp tongues and extensive experience, raw conscripts who had only recently left the towns and villages of the Spanish mainland, and native Moroccan troops whose traditions included both acts of notable courage and a readiness for the more ruthless demands of combat. The Army of Africa had already established firm control over all of Spanish Morocco. Its units maintained an iron grip on the territory, creating a secure base along the North African coast where preparations for larger operations could proceed without immediate threat. In the northern provinces of Spain, General Moller's troops stood in readiness. They waited to secure those regions for the uprising, forming an essential northern arm that would work in coordination with the southern force now under Franco's direction. Rightist elements had secured several other positions as well. They controlled the Canary Islands and scattered areas in western Spain, while key cities in the southwest had declared their support for the rebellion, creating pockets of sympathy within a land where the Republic still held authority over most territories. The rebels pursued a clear and ambitious initial strategy. They planned for Franco's troops to cross the western end of the Mediterranean and enter Spain from the south, after which the southern and northern forces would advance toward each other with the aim of converging upon the center of the country. Their main objective was the city of Madrid, this densely populated industrial center and symbolic capital held critical importance in their thinking, as they believed that closing upon it from two directions could deliver a blow capable of shattering Republican resistance across the nation. The Mediterranean waters lay calm and expansive between the shores. They offered a vital route for the Army of Africa to reach the Spanish mainland, where the strategy of convergence would soon be put to the test amid the hills and plains of the Iberian Peninsula. Franco's assumption of command brought a focused purpose to the southern effort. With this diverse army under his guidance, the rebels possessed a powerful tool for their southern advance, one that blended professional skill with the fierce spirit of its various components. The pincer movement toward Madrid reflected both strategic vision and high stakes. By approaching the capital from opposite sides, the rebels hoped to create conditions in which the Republican government would find itself squeezed between advancing columns, potentially leading to a rapid conclusion to the conflict. Soft winds moved across the airfield where the command had just been established. They stirred the warm air around the assembled soldiers and equipment, carrying a sense of quiet determination as the broader plan began to move from concept to action. This moment represented the true beginning of the military campaign. The Army of Africa, now unified under Franco's leadership, prepared to launch the southern thrust of a strategy designed to strike at the heart of Spain and bring the rebellion to a decisive early advantage. The grand design carried the weight of possibility and risk in equal measure. Two forces advancing from north and south toward a shared destination in Madrid embodied the hope that bold and coordinated action might resolve the divisions that had torn the nation apart. In the end, the Army of Africa and the strategy it served stood as the opening statement of the rebellion's military intentions. With its distinctive composition and clear objective, it set the stage for the campaigns that would follow across the Spanish landscape in the months to come. General Moller set his northern forces into motion on the 19th of July. With careful coordination, the columns began their advance across the landscape, carrying the hopes of the rebellion toward a single destination that held the power to reshape the entire conflict in a matter of weeks. When one of his officers asked which of the four advancing groups would likely reach the capital first, Moller gave an answer that would enter the language forever. He spoke not of any visible column of soldiers, but of something far more elusive, replying simply that the honor would belong to his fifth column, the hidden supporters already living and working inside Madrid, who stood ready to assist from within when the time came. This idea of an internal force added a layer of quiet intrigue to the campaign. It suggested that victory might come, not only from the strength of marching troops but also from the silent work of those who shared the cause, yet remained concealed among the city's everyday population. Madrid occupied a unique position in the minds of every participant. The city served as both the political capital and a major center of industry, its streets filled with the constant activity of a dense population whose daily lives sustained the nation's heart. Its importance reached beyond mere geography or numbers. As the seat of government and a symbol of the Republic itself, Madrid represented the very soul of the established order, a place where authority, identity, and practical power all converged in one vital location. Both sides recognized the decisive nature of this prize. They understood that should the rebels manage to take Madrid in the early stages, such a triumph would likely break the spirit of resistance throughout the country and open the way to a swift end to the struggle. The awareness created a particular kind of tension around the capital. It drew the focus of commanders and citizens alike, turning the approaches to Madrid into the most significant theater of the opening phase. Rebel movements gradually gathered momentum toward the city. Units began shifting their positions with increasing purpose, following the lines of advance that pointed directly at the heart of Republican power. The summer light fell across the plains and hills leading to Madrid. It illuminated the paths that armies would soon follow, casting long shadows that seemed to hint at the weight of what might soon unfold in and around the capital. This emphasis on Madrid reflected a deeper strategic vision. By targeting the central point where political and military strength met, the rebels hoped to deliver a blow that would echo across every province and town still loyal to the government. The notion of the fifth column brought an additional dimension of possibility. It reminded everyone that the fight for the capital would involve not only open battle, but also the unseen currents of loyalty moving quietly through its neighborhoods and institutions. In those early days, the city continued its familiar routines. Yet an undercurrent of anticipation ran beneath the surface, as people sensed that the converging forces might soon test the resilience of Madrid in ways few could yet imagine. The strategic value of the capital remained clear and compelling. Capturing it promised not just territorial gain, but a psychological victory that could potentially collapse the Republican cause before it had time to fully organize its defense. The early rebel advances thus carried profound meaning. They represented a calculated effort to strike at the center before the opposition could gather its full strength, all centered on a city whose fall might determine the destiny of the entire nation. Madrid held its breath in those uncertain days. Manuel Azaña, the President of the Republic, stood at the center of a fragile web of loyalty, able to summon the Navy's remaining strength, scattered but steadfast units of the regular army, elements of the Air Force still flying under Republican colors, and thousands upon thousands of everyday Spaniards who had stepped forward as citizen soldiers ready to defend the government they had chosen. These ordinary men and women formed the living heart of a new kind of defense. Belonging to labor unions and a broad spectrum of political parties, they had quietly organized themselves into unofficial militia bands in the months before the crisis exploded, bringing little formal training, yet carrying an unshakable conviction that the Republic was worth every sacrifice. The outbreak of fighting called forth their full commitment. 4 out of every 5 of these citizen militia units chose without hesitation to mobilize on behalf of the Republic, pouring into the streets and fields with whatever weapons they could find, and a spirit that would soon become legendary. The names chosen by each side carried their own quiet poetry. Those who stayed true to the elected government became known far beyond Spain's borders, particularly in the United States and Britain, as loyalists, while the rebels proudly called themselves nationalists, wrapping their cause in the mantle of the nation itself. The balance of forces at the beginning told a tale of hope mixed with hardship. Azaña could count on a combined strength of perhaps 250,000 men, a figure that appeared to outnumber the nationalists' 150,000, yet this numerical edge masked a deeper and more dangerous reality. The loyalist side suffered from a painful shortage of proper arms. While the nationalists possessed better equipment overall, Azaña's forces often lacked artillery entirely and struggled even to find enough small arms and ammunition to equip every fighter, leaving courage and numbers to stand against steel and supply lines. Azaña himself moved through these early weeks with a heavy and reluctant heart. He felt no burning passion for the war that had come upon his country, and right-wing publications had taken to branding him the monster, partly because of his unremarkable features, but mostly because of his firm and unyielding opposition to their vision. Yet among all the central figures of the drama, he alone seemed capable of stepping back far enough to seek another path. Through his war minister, General José Miaja, he extended a proposal for a broad coalition government that would have brought General Mola into the fold, hoping against hope that compromise might still prevent the full horror of civil strife. The Spanish Navy wrote one of the most vivid and violent chapters of those first days. When the enlisted sailors received orders to turn their guns against the Republic, they refused with sudden and absolute resolve, seizing the moment as a chance to settle years of accumulated grievances against the most tyrannical officers in the fleet. Aboard the battleship Jaime I, far out on the open sea, the confrontation reached its terrible climax. Officers and crew clashed in savage hand-to-hand fighting that continued without mercy until every officer lay dead, a scene of raw fury that would echo through the entire Navy. The wave of retribution spread with astonishing speed. Within just 2 days after the first shots of the war had been fired, 98% of all officers serving on vessels at sea had been killed, leaving the ships almost entirely in the hands of the enlisted men. Only one squadron held out in the northern harbor of El Ferrol. Everywhere else, the Spanish Navy now operated under committees formed by the sailors themselves, who immediately turned their ships into instruments of the Republic by clamping a tight blockade across the Strait of Gibraltar and trapping much of the Army of Africa on the Moroccan shore. On the 5th of August, Franco managed a small and risky breakthrough. He succeeded in slipping 1,000 of his men across the strait aboard a tug, a tramp steamer, and 2 mail packet boats. Yet for a time, this modest reinforcement remained the limit of what the rebels could achieve by sea. The Mediterranean waters carried the weight of these events with their usual calm. Waves lapped gently against hulls that had recently rung with shouts and gunfire, while the new commanders of the fleet worked to turn revolutionary zeal into something resembling order. Such was the complex tapestry of loyalist strength in those opening weeks. Vast numbers of willing defenders stood beside untrained but fiercely devoted militias, and a navy reborn through mutiny, yet all of them labored under the shadow of serious material shortages that would test their resolve again and again. The Republic's defense rested on human spirit as much as on steel. From the quiet determination of President Azania to the raw courage of sailors who had seized their ships and citizens who had taken up arms with almost nothing, the Loyalist cause revealed both its profound vulnerabilities and its unexpected wells of endurance. In the warm summer evenings that followed those first dramatic shifts, the air itself seemed to carry the mingled sense of sea salt and distant gunpowder. It reminded everyone that the struggle ahead would be measured not only in battles won or lost, but in the daily choices of ordinary people who had decided their republic was worth every hardship. The burden of difficult choices settled over the capital like a heavy summer mist. Manuel Azaña, as President of the Republic, faced mounting pressure from workers all across Spain who were demanding weapons so they could take up the fight against the advancing nationalists with their own hands. He made the painful decision to refuse these requests for arms. His choice ultimately left the Loyalist side without the critical firepower that might have altered early battles. Yet in those uncertain weeks, it still felt like the only responsible course open to him. The Republican government had always existed as a carefully balanced creation. It was a loose gathering of many different groups and interests, held together primarily by a moderate liberal center that struggled daily to maintain some sense of cohesion amid deeply competing ideas about the nation's future. Beyond this central core lay more turbulent waters, a volatile mix of anarchists who envisioned a world without any form of state control, Trotskyites following their distinct path toward revolution, and communists loyal to the line from Moscow, created a restless and unpredictable element on the fringes of the coalition. Azaña carried a particular kind of quiet fear regarding the distribution of weapons. He worried that placing guns into the hands of these passionate factions might lead them to turn those weapons not only against their common enemy, but against each other, or even more dangerously, against his own government and the fragile stability it was trying to preserve. This internal fragility created a constant undercurrent of unease within the Republican ranks. The coalition that formed the backbone of the Loyalist cause often felt more like a temporary and uneasy alliance than a solid, unified front, constantly threatened by the sharp ideological differences that ran like deep cracks beneath the surface of their shared resistance. He moved carefully through these political minefields. Every decision carried the weight of potential consequences that could tear the Republic apart from within, even as it fought desperately for survival against the forces gathering on the outside. The atmosphere in government buildings grew increasingly heavy during those weeks. Late-night meetings unfolded under dim lights where voices rose and fell in passionate debate, revealing both the genuine idealism and the dangerous fractures that defined the Republican experiment in its hour of greatest need. Such were the profound political dilemmas that tested the heart of the Loyalist leadership from the very beginning. Azaña's refusal to arm certain factions reflected a sober awareness of the risks involved, a recognition that the greatest danger to the Republic might come not solely from the battlefields, but from the volatile passions simmering within its own diverse ranks. The coalition's fragility became more apparent with each passing day. Different groups pulled in their own directions, each convinced that their particular vision offered the true path forward, creating a situation where unity remained an aspiration rather than a daily reality. These ideological fractures ran deep through the loyalist cause. They represented more than simple political disagreements, touching on fundamental questions about the nature of freedom, authority, and the kind of society that should emerge from the ashes of the old order. In the quiet moments between urgent discussions, Azania must have felt the immense loneliness of his position. Surrounded by advisors and allies who each brought their own fierce convictions, he alone seemed to carry the full awareness of how easily the entire structure could collapse under the pressure of its own contradictions. The Spanish sun continued to rise each morning over a divided capital. Its light revealed both the determination of those ready to fight and the subtle tensions that threatened to undermine their collective strength from within. In the end, these internal divisions formed one of the most tragic dimensions of the Republican story. Even as brave citizens took to the streets and fields in defense of their government, the leaders in Madrid wrestled with the knowledge that their coalition remained a delicate thing, beautiful in its diversity, yet dangerously vulnerable to the very passions that had given it life. The early days of the conflict descended into a profound darkness. Revenge and long-held grievances surfaced with shocking intensity as both sides surrendered to the rawest aspects of human nature amid the chaos of civil war. One of the most harrowing incidents took place in the historic bull ring of Badajoz. Chicago Tribune correspondent Jay Allen bore witness as nationalist troops joined by local landlords settling accounts after 5 years of intense peasant unrest in the area, marched groups of men and women into the arena through the traditional entrance gate used by bullfighters. There, waiting machine guns opened fire. 1,800 people, including many women, were cut down in the slaughter. Brutality also claimed many lives in areas under Republican control. Throughout central Spain, the southeast and the east, regions where anti-clerical sentiment burned particularly hot, accounts spread of devout Catholics being bound to crucifixes before having their limbs savagely hacked off. The violence against the church reached a terrible scale. Loyalist forces executed 12 bishops during this period. Among them were 2 prelates who endured their final hours compelled to scrub the decks of a prison ship. One siege, however, transcended the general horror to become a lasting emblem of resolve. After nationalist troops captured Toledo, loyalist militia forces counterattacked and surrounded the city's ancient fortress, the Alcazar. Inside, Colonel José Moscardo commanded a determined garrison that refused to yield despite severe shortages. The defenders had little food remaining, but retained their weapons and their will. Moscardo and his men prepared to endure whatever came, holding their position within the massive stone walls of the historic structure. The most memorable moment of the siege arrived through a single telephone call. A Republican commander contacted Moscardo and issued a stark threat. If the Alcazar did not surrender at once, his son Luis, who had been taken captive that morning, would be put to death. Father and son were placed on the line together. "Papa," the boy said softly. "What is happening, son?" asked the colonel. "Nothing," Luis replied. "They say they will shoot me if the Alcazar does not surrender." Moscardo answered without a moment's pause, his voice steady. "If it be true, commend your soul to God. Shout Viva España and die like a hero. Goodbye, my son. A last kiss." The boy's final words came back across the wire. "Goodbye, father. A very big kiss." Colonel Moscardo then spoke his last sentence into the telephone. "The Alcazar will never surrender." His son was executed soon afterward. Yet the Alcazar itself held out. 2 months later, advancing nationalist forces broke the siege and rescued Moscardo along with the surviving defenders. These stories from the opening phase of the war carry an enduring weight. They reveal how quickly the conflict descended into cycles of revenge, from the machine gun massacre in Badajoz to the killings of clergy, and how moments of profound personal courage, like Moscardo's, could still shine through the darkness. The warm Spanish air during those weeks seemed to hold the echoes of both screams and quiet prayers. In the tragedy of Badajoz, in the suffering of the bishops, and most movingly in the telephone conversation between Colonel Moscardo and his son, the human cost of the Spanish Civil War found some of its most unforgettable expressions. The naval blockade tightened its grip. Franco turned to Mussolini with an urgent plea for immediate help, requesting 12 transport planes, 3 fighters, and a supply of bombs that could break the loyalist stranglehold on the Strait of Gibraltar and allow his Army of Africa to reach the Spanish mainland at last. Mussolini responded with swift and decisive action. He dispatched 12 Savoia 81 aircraft without delay, confident that this modest gesture would bring the entire conflict to a quick and favorable close. Yet those planes proved only the beginning of far greater Italian commitment that would ultimately include 763 aircraft in total, along with at least 50,000 troops and substantial material consisting of 1,930 cannon, plus 240,747 small arms. The support from fascist Italy flowed steadily across the Mediterranean. It strengthened nationalist positions at critical moments, providing the kind of sustained reinforcement that gradually shifted the balance of power on the ground and in the skies above contested Spanish towns and valleys. Far to the north in Berlin, another appeal reached receptive ears. Franco sent requests for additional aid, and both Goering and Hitler agreed without hesitation to send men and munitions that would soon play a transforming role in the unfolding struggle. Hitler viewed the opportunity through a wider strategic lens. He hoped the Spanish venture would draw Italy more firmly into Germany's sphere of influence through their shared involvement, while also guaranteeing future access to Spain's rich deposits of iron ore, essential for German industry and rearmament. Goering carried his own distinct motivations into the decision. He saw the conflict as a chance to prevent the further spread of communism across Europe, and, equally important, an ideal testing ground where he could evaluate the performance of his young Luftwaffe in real combat conditions across various technical aspects. By the month of August, the German contribution began to materialize in visible form. 30 transport planes took to the air bound for Morocco, carrying crews who would soon be joined by 6 fighter pilots and their aircraft to form the initial core of what became known as the Condor Legion, a specialized air and ground force composed entirely of German personnel operating under the nationalist banner. These men arrived with careful discretion. They traveled in ordinary civilian clothing and carried regular tourist passports so they could move through loyalist-held territories without drawing attention before reaching the areas under nationalist control. The Legion grew steadily in strength and capability. Large numbers of German technicians and flyers continued to arrive, taking up positions with planes, tanks, and anti-aircraft units, though the exact numbers and composition shifted from month to month as the needs of the campaign evolved. The Mediterranean winds carried the distant rumble of engines during those weeks. They stirred the warm air above the waves where Italian and German aircraft made their crossings, blending the scent of salt with the faint metallic tang of fuel and machinery that signaled the growing presence of foreign powers in Spain's internal conflict. Such was the pattern of intervention that steadily deepened the war's international dimensions. Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany poured material and human resources into the nationalist cause with increasing generosity, their support arriving in waves that would shape battles yet to come and foreshadow larger alignments on the European stage. The Condor Legion in particular brought a new level of coordination and technical skill. Its pilots and crews tested tactics and equipment under live conditions, gaining experience that would later prove valuable in conflicts far beyond the Iberian Peninsula. Italian forces complemented this effort through sheer volume and persistence. Their troops and aircraft provided the kind of sustained pressure that helped maintain momentum for the nationalist advance, even when local resources ran thin. Together, these interventions transformed the character of the fighting. What had begun as a Spanish rebellion gradually took on the contours of a larger ideological contest, with foreign powers contributing men, machines, and strategic vision that would influence the course of the war for years to come. In the quiet hours before dawn, the sound of approaching aircraft sometimes drifted across coastal towns. It carried both the promise of reinforcement for one side and the subtle reminder that the Spanish sky was no longer entirely Spanish, as the hands of Mussolini and Hitler reached across the sea to shape events on the ground below. The arrival of the Condor Legion and the steady flow of Italian support marked a turning point in the conflict's early months. They represented more than simple military aid. They embodied the willingness of two powerful regimes to invest heavily in the nationalist cause, setting patterns that would echo through the larger global storm gathering on the horizon. The loyalist cause reached across oceans and borders in quiet desperation. In the first months of battle, a handful of outsiders arrived on their own, drawn by conviction rather than orders, most notably the French writer André Malraux, who came to fight beside the defenders of Madrid with nothing but his words and his willingness to stand in the line of fire. By the closing weeks of that first summer, the trickle had become a steady current. Men and women from every corner of Europe, from the United States and from Canada, began to pour into Spain, forming themselves into the International Brigades, a remarkable volunteer army that would write one of the most idealistic chapters of the entire war. The organization of these brigades carried its own distinct character. Communist networks provided the bulk of the senior officers and the disciplined structure that held the units together, while the ranks filled with idealists of every background who had answered a personal call to defend the Spanish Republic against the rising shadow of dictatorship. Their numbers grew until they told a story of extraordinary commitment. 40,000 people eventually took up arms within the international brigades, among them 3,000 Americans who formed the Abraham Lincoln Battalion, young men who crossed an ocean simply because they believed the fight for freedom in Spain belonged to all who cherished it. The Mediterranean air carried the low murmur of their arrivals during those late summer nights, Trains and ships delivered them to ports and stations where they stepped off into the warm Spanish darkness, shoulders squared beneath civilian coats, eyes bright with the same quiet resolve that had once sent young men to other distant causes. Meanwhile, the Republican government turned eastward for more substantial help. The Soviet Union had at first inclined toward non-intervention, watching the conflict from afar with careful restraint. Yet as Italian and German assistance continued to flow toward Franco, Moscow gradually shifted its stance and began to offer direct support to the loyalists. Russian personnel and equipment crossed into Spain in increasing volume. More than 2,000 Soviet advisors and specialists arrived to bolster the Republican effort, accompanied by at least 240 planes, 1,200 guns, and 700 tanks that would soon make their presence felt on the battlefields. The exchange came at a heavy price for the Republic. In return for this vital assistance, Madrid shipped its entire gold reserve, more than $315 million in bullion, across the sea to the port of Odessa, where it disappeared into Soviet vaults as payment for the material that kept the loyalist cause alive. The weight of those gold crates must have pressed heavily on the decks of the ships that carried them. They moved through the same waters where Italian and German aircraft now flew overhead, a silent transaction that bound the Spanish Republic ever more tightly to the distant power in the east. Such was the dual nature of outside help on the loyalist side. While thousands of idealistic volunteers brought their hearts and their lives to the international brigades, the Soviet Union supplied the steel and the organization that allowed the Republic to continue fighting against superior armament and experience. The contrast between the two streams of support created a complex and poignant reality. One was born of personal conviction and youthful courage, the other of calculated state interest. Yet together they formed the fragile lifeline that sustained the defense of Madrid and the broader Republican effort through the long months ahead. In the soft glow of evening campfires along the Spanish roads, the voices of American volunteers sometimes mixed with the accents of French, German, and Italian fighters. Their songs and stories rose into the night air, carrying the same hopeful spirit that had once animated other generations who believed a single distant struggle could shape the future of freedom itself. The Soviet gold ships slipped quietly out of Spanish harbors under cover of darkness. They left behind empty vaults and the quiet knowledge that the Republic had traded its future treasure for the weapons needed to survive the present, a bargain whose full cost would only become clear in the years that followed. Franco studied the stubborn resistance of the capital. After months of fierce fighting that had failed to deliver the quick victory he once hoped for, he accepted that Madrid would not fall easily, and so he turned his attention toward a different approach, one that would slowly consume the country piece by piece. The siege of Madrid had become a grinding test of wills. By mid-October, artillery fire could be heard clearly in the streets, as swarms of refugees, many leading livestock, streamed into the city from the surrounding countryside. The government imposed an 11 o'clock curfew and began rationing water, food and milk, while huge frightening posters appeared in public squares, warning that if the city fell, half its inhabitants would share the fate of those massacred at Badajoz. On the 6th of November, the government relocated to Valencia. General Miaga, a grandfatherly figure of 58, was left in command of the defense. He gathered his senior officers and spoke with blunt urgency, telling them the government had departed and Madrid now stood alone at the mercy of the enemy. He demanded they fight as men, as machos, prepared to die in their positions rather than retreat. The people of Madrid responded with extraordinary resolve. Women took charge of supply services while children built barricades in the streets. In apartments above, mothers prepared pots of boiling oil to pour down on any nationalist soldiers who might break through. Labor unions issued stark instructions to their members. The supply of weapons was limited, but the supply of willing bodies was not. The nationalists launched their main assault on the 7th of November. They pushed into the Casa de Campo, a large park that stretched from the western edge into the heart of the city. Loyalist militiamen slipped behind their lines at one point and detonated explosives among the advancing troops. When a key bridge appeared about to fall, women passing by seized rifles from a nearby depot and helped drive the enemy back. Reinforcements arrived at the critical moment. On the 8th of November, the first units of the international brigades entered the city carrying Russian weapons. Their commander skillfully mixed his men among the local defenders, and the defense immediately stiffened. In the university city sector, brigade members built barricades using heavy volumes of books on philosophy and metaphysics that proved surprisingly effective against bullets. Miaja himself appeared wherever the line seemed ready to break. He moved among his troops shouting encouragement, reminding them that the only acceptable retreat was to the cemetery. The battle settled into a long and bitter stalemate that would continue until the end of March, when Franco finally called off the direct assault but kept the city surrounded for nearly 2 more years. Recognizing that Madrid would not yield quickly, Franco adopted a strategy of gradual attrition. He turned his attention northward toward the Basque and Asturian provinces. These regions represented 1/3 of Spain and contained the country's richest coal and iron mines, along with more than 30% of its industry. Capturing them would give the nationalists control of the entire north and a powerful economic advantage. The campaign in the north carried the heavy imprint of German influence. In April, the nationalists began their offensive, with the Condor Legion using the Basque countryside as a laboratory to test new aerial tactics, particularly the coordinated use of incendiary and high-explosive bombs. Bilbao and the smaller industrial center of Durango were struck first. Then came the most infamous episode of the entire northern campaign. On the afternoon of the 26th of April in 1937, the small town of Guernica, a road and rail junction of about 7,000 people located 18 miles east of Bilbao, came under sustained attack. 2 nuns began ringing the church bells and crying "Aviones, aviones," as waves of Heinkel bombers appeared overhead. One bomber released a 550-pound bomb directly into the crowded plaza opposite the railway station. A survivor later described how groups of women and children were lifted high into the air, perhaps 20 feet, before their bodies began to break apart with terrible consequences. 8 more waves of planes followed before darkness fell. 1,600 people were killed and 900 wounded. Neither of the small munitions plants in the town was hit. The international reaction was immediate and horrified. Accusations of deliberate terror bombing spread rapidly. Berlin ordered the Condor Legion to remain silent about the raid, while nationalist propagandists claimed the Basques themselves had destroyed the town with dynamite as they retreated. The loyalists abandoned Guernica 2 days later. Pablo Picasso, working in Paris, began painting his monumental canvas Guernica in response to the atrocity. The work would become one of the most powerful artistic statements against the horrors of modern war. and a lasting symbol for the defenders of the Spanish Republic. The fall of the North followed with grim inevitability. The defensive perimeter known as the Iron Ring around Bilbao crumbled under sustained pressure. Bilbao itself fell in June, and by the end of October 1937, after a 7-month campaign, the nationalists had secured the entire Basque and Asturian region. They now controlled all of northern Spain, the western border, and much of the south, more than 60% of the country. The Basque countryside still carried the scars of those months. The smell of scorched earth and the silence that followed the roar of engines lingered long after the planes had gone, marking the places where a new and terrible kind of warfare had announced itself to the world. This shift from the stubborn defense of Madrid to the methodical conquest of the industrial north represented a decisive turning point. Franco's patience and the growing foreign support behind him was slowly reshaping the map of Spain, one province at a time. The Loyalists reached for one final chance to alter their fate. Republican spies within Franco's inner circle learned of his plan for a fresh assault on Madrid, so the government chose to strike first at Teruel, a strategic city lying between Madrid and Spain's eastern Mediterranean coast. The offensive opened on the 15th of December beneath a merciless winter sky. Temperatures fell to 18 degrees below zero, with winds that cut through every layer of clothing like invisible knives. Yet the Loyalists fought with fierce determination, beating back repeated nationalist counterattacks and capturing the city after 26 days of brutal combat. Franco refused to accept the loss. He poured overwhelming force into the frozen region, and after nearly 2 more months of savage fighting in the snow and ice, his troops recaptured Teruel in late February of 1938. This setback convinced the Germans to commit more deeply to the nationalist cause. General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma, an expert in armored warfare, introduced coordinated tank and air assaults that ignored traditional doctrine by concentrating the panzers in unified formations rather than spreading them among infantry units. The new tactics proved devastating. German armor tore through Republican defenses along the route leading east from Teruel toward the sea. On the 15th of April, nationalist troops reached the Mediterranean at Vinaròs, slicing Republican territory into 2 isolated fragments. One pocket held Catalonia and its key port of Barcelona. The other, larger zone connected Madrid in the center, with Valencia on the southeast coast and Almeria farther south, creating a vulnerable triangle that would prove impossible to defend for long. The Loyalists attempted one last major counterstroke in July. They crossed the Ebro River from north to south, striking at the thin nationalist line guarding the rear of Franco's latest advance in the hope of regaining momentum. The effort could not be sustained. Within a week, the nationalists regained the initiative. By November, the Ebro fighting had cost the Loyalists 70,000 men killed, wounded or captured, while nationalist losses were less than half that number. The Republic was now clearly on the ropes. Daily existence in the shrinking Loyalist zones had grown almost unbearable. In Madrid, the daily food ration had fallen to 2 ounces of lentils, beans or rice per person. In Barcelona, now the seat of government, long lines of quiet women dressed in black waited outside nearly empty shops, hoping for even the smallest amount of rice or beans that were often unavailable at any price. On the 21st of September, the Loyalist government made a painful public announcement. Realizing the futility of continued resistance, they declared their readiness to withdraw all international brigades and appealed to the League of Nations for any intervention that might prevent unconditional surrender. The foreign volunteers began their departure. 3 days later, the Abraham Lincoln Battalion withdrew from the front, and across the remaining Republican territory, men from many nations prepared to leave the country they had come to love. During a farewell ceremony in Barcelona, La Pasionaria addressed the assembled brigades with deep emotion, promising they would never be forgotten, and inviting them to return one day when the olive tree of peace bloomed again beside the laurels of Republican victory. Franco offered no compromise. By November, the nationalists had massed 300,000 well-armed soldiers for the final push into Catalonia against 220,000 Republican troops equipped with worn weapons and critically low ammunition. The end came with startling speed. When Franco launched his offensive toward Barcelona on the 23rd of December, his forces swept forward almost without resistance. 1 million refugees had crowded into the city, creating impossible conditions for food and shelter. When Franco entered Barcelona on the 26th of January 1939, he found white flags of surrender hanging from buildings and a starving population waiting for the food convoys his radio had promised. The Republic collapsed in waves of exhaustion and despair. Hundreds of thousands of loyalists fled toward the French border. By the 10th of February, when Franco sealed the frontier, 500,000 people had crossed into exile. President Azaña and most of his cabinet also departed for France, gathering there to consider the future. Most now agreed that continued resistance served no purpose. Colonel Segismundo Casado, the loyalist commander in the Madrid region, shared this grim assessment. Madrid was cold and hungry, with almost no fuel remaining. His soldiers possessed only 1 rifle for every 5 men, and just 10 tanks in total. On the 5th of March, he opened negotiations with Franco, hoping to buy time for Republican officers to escape. The final collapse happened almost without a major battle. Before any large-scale assault could begin, the exhausted Republican armies simply dissolved. Men abandoned their positions and began walking home. At midday on the 28th of March, the nationalists entered the heart of Madrid. The streets suddenly filled with members of the Fifth Column. These clandestine nationalist supporters who had waited years in silence now emerged openly. For years they had endured the loyalist cry of "No pasarán," "They shall not pass," as Franco's troops paraded through the capital. The Fifth Column shouted back triumphantly, "Han pasarán, they have passed." Franco waited with his customary patience and reserve. He remained in Madrid while his units eliminated the last pockets of resistance, refusing to proclaim total victory until the final fighting had ceased. On the 30th of March 1939, an aide informed him that all resistance had ended and he held complete command of Spain. His only response was characteristically brief. "Very good," he said quietly. The Spanish Civil War had lasted 33 months. It claimed more than 600,000 lives and cost over $15 billion. It left another totalitarian regime in Europe. The conflict had served several foreign powers well. The Soviet Union received $315 million in Spanish gold. Germany and Italy gained valuable combat experience for their forces, along with access to Spain's iron ore and magnesium for their munitions industries. Among Western leaders, quiet regrets began to surface. In America, President Roosevelt wondered whether he should have done more to stop what he now saw as a dangerous victory for anti-democratic forces. In Britain, Winston Churchill reflected that the policy of non-intervention had brought his country closer to the very dangers they had hoped to avoid. On the 5th of June 1939, the men of the Condor Legion returned home to a grand parade in Berlin. The British writer George Orwell, who had fought for the Republic, came back to an England that seemed untouched by the tragedy. He described walking through the familiar scenes of his childhood, the railway cuttings covered in wild flowers, the deep meadows where great horses grazed peacefully, the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, the red buses and blue policemen, and felt that the country was still sleeping a deep, deep sleep from which it might only awaken when the roar of bombs finally broke the silence. The war had ended, but its shadows stretched far into the future. A nation lay exhausted beneath the weight of victory and defeat, while the world moved unknowingly closer to an even greater catastrophe that the Spanish struggle had both previewed and prepared.